Welcome back to Reynolds Runabouts, everybody. I'm Jeffrey Reynolds, and today we are going to do the second part of the transom repair, and that is the exterior of it, which had a lot of work done to it as well. In fact, it was probably the worst side, a lot of replacement wood, and then I finished it off with a beautiful piece of a mahogany Akume plywood 3/8, which really finished it off and it will look beautiful on the boat. I have the first plywood layup on the back complete and it's dried. So now I have my shape. It's proud of that, so I can always, ferret down to fit the transom perfectly, as is this vertical timber scarf that I put on. So now what I'm going to do, I know for sure that I've got 6 inches of bad wood. And because this is 1/4 inch plywood, I'm going to do 12:1, which is really 3 inches per every layer of plywood that I apply. And it looks like I have about 4. And then the 5th one will be this veneer layer that goes on one large sheet that will match the deck and the other piece that I'm doing with new plywood. So what I'm going to do is at least go back 6 inches. I know there's rot, but I also have marked off in 3-inch increments. If I find rot, I'll just keep going until I get to, I need to get, this is probably the worst layer. So I'm going to take this off as far as I need. Then I'll start doing my 3-inch scarves based on that. But until I figure that out, I really can't do much. So we're going to start cutting into this, and then I'll know what I'm going to do is end up stepping it. So I'll go down to the lowest layer, which will be the longest as well, and I'll start scarfing shorter pieces. And then I'll go ahead, because I have to see it, right? And then in the end, I'll have one big piece of plywood that'll tie it all back into a single piece. So I'm pretty confident about the strength that I'm going to add to it. It was a well-built transom, very strong, easy to fix. Well, easy to fix if you think of it in an evasive way, but a lot of good remaining wood was here. I'm glad I decided to go ahead and try to preserve it. And now I'll just go back and rebuild it kind of the way that the builder did, and with better glues and better wood. So back to work. So I'm happy to report that the rot thankfully stopped on the piece of plywood that my new patch from yesterday is attached to. It felt pretty good from the other side when I did the epoxy application, so I had pretty good confidence that it was fine. This is a screw hole or a fastener hole that came in from the transom. So what I'll do is I'll fill that with thickened epoxy. When I go to put the new piece on that'll have thickened epoxy in it. And then, so now what I'll do is go ahead and I'll put a small patch in here, and then I'll lay, the next layer will be on top of that. And then the next layer, I'm going to come back 3 inches. There's a little bit of a gap here, but this is all going to get ferreted off as I'm trying to get down to this level for this cross member, because that's where I start building up my finish veneer. So I'll end up going back another 3 inches. So I'll have a step, and then a step. And then I'll start doing full, if I have to go back one more, I can, but then I'm going to run into this veneer sheet. This is going to come off. So I'll have this full piece yet to apply. So I've got plenty of plywood coming to work with. So happy about that. save me some time, save the frame, and then I'll fair it all off before I put this final piece on when the plywood arrives, and we'll have a pretty good looking transom and solid. I have as much faired as I want. I got this cleaned up, got the old glue off, got it down to where I'm happy with the wood. And even though this is going to be a little proud, this is a thinner sheet that was in there originally. I'm going to go ahead and put in this 1/4 inch piece, and then I'll just fair it off as I start layering these up. I'll fair this correctly. So, like always, I'm going to go in here and um, put in some unthickened epoxy. This has got epoxy on it from the original layup, so it's already been sealed. But I'll just put a coat on there in case I buzz through it with the sanding. Got that on there. So the end grain over here is probably my biggest concern, but that looks good. That smoothed out, end grain on the joining plywood. Make sure I know what I'm doing here. There, so I'm going to do this side. This one has definitely not been sealed. I'm just orientating to my grain. I'm trying to keep the grain going the same way. That way I know I've got the right, putting the right side in the right place. Get that end grain really saturated. That's where it's going to soak up. And I'm going to go mix up a batch of the thickened version, and I'll let this set. I'll come back and check it, and then I'll go ahead and glue this up for a small repair, but what I've got to do anyways. All right, I've got my thickened epoxy. I'm going to start with the joints. Get it all nice and peanut buttery in there. One thing I have learned from the Total Boat silica filler is that it mixes faster and more complete and thicker than the West system, which it seems like you have to put twice as much. So, something to think about. Get that all nice and slathered. I'll put a coat on here. At this point, I'd rather have stuff squeezing out and waste it than not have enough. This is a really important part of the boat. The joint is important. I want to make sure we have lots of goop everywhere. And when it's white, you know, you got plenty in there. Happy with that. Put my repair down. Get the squeeze out. Got a clamp over here. I'm going to give it just enough to hold it. Because again, I don't want to squeeze it out all the way out. Starve the joint. Tight that way. There. And you can see the squeeze out. And then of course you can always just come in here and take your excess and get it down into those grooves. And I will call this repair done. And then eventually I'll just be building up until we get a really nice base for the new piece of the veneer, or the last piece of plywood that'll go on. All this will be covered. So until the next time. I am ready to put on the second patch on the outside, the exterior of the transom frame. This was my first patch. I put one, remember, on the bottom to give me the form. Then I put in a corner patch, faired that down. So now I'm double coated both this piece and the frame itself with unthickened epoxy, so they're sealed. And then I applied the thickened epoxy with silica. I'm going to put that in. This will be my second one. I'm getting really close to having it fair up to this block. And that's where I want to be, because here's where I'm going to put that new veneer piece on eventually. So I'm going to get that. That's on there. Got some nice squeeze out. I've got some extra filler in here. I can move it around a little bit. And I'll clamp that down, and we'll have the second piece on. And then tomorrow I'll go ahead and lay the third piece, so the lap will be way over here. And I'll have that all figured out and ready to go. And then we'll be ready for the final piece, which will be the veneer piece, which will come when I get the transom ready to go back on the boat. I'm now ready to put the third patch on the outside of the transom. I've got unthickened epoxy on both surfaces, the frame and then the new piece. I've got my silica thickened epoxy ready to go with a little bit of fiber in it to give it a little more strength, since this is kind of a major important part for the boat, keeping it together. Once I get this done, this patch will allow me to call the subsurface, I'll call it, done. And then what I'm going to do is fair the old and new surfaces out so that I have a fair surface for the new veneer plywood that will go on eventually. So I need to get that ready to go. And so when I get that plywood in from the supplier, it'll be ready to put on, and I'll mark it up and I'll cut it. So like always, I'm going to put a little bit of pressure on these. This has got a curve in it, so I need to make sure I find my curve, especially on the end here. I have to get it so that it's curving down this way. So I've got a couple complex curves going on that I need to make sure are ready to go. Make sure all my seams are tight. And then I'll put a little pressure on just to get the squeeze out. And I know that I've got my curve in play. If I don't get that right, the laminate really is going to have to be faired down, and it's going to leave gaps. So I really need to make sure I get everything where it belongs. Give this a little, this is where my curve is. There's my squeeze out. And I look down in here, I see good squeeze out. I might even put one out here just to make sure that I'm getting that beautiful barrel back over here. And we'll let that one set. And looking forward to getting that all faired off so I can go ahead and get ready for the final layer and call this repair done. So I've finished removing that last 3/8 inch piece of veneer that was on the top. You remember I took all this out because it was rotten, and I knew that I wanted to get it uniform with no seam when we finished the boat. So I knew I had to take that off. Glad I did. I found just chunks of the last layer coming off in chunks at the glue line. There was a glue line right here, probably from the builder. and it just popped right up. Plywood wouldn't do that. I mean, the factory wouldn't allow that. So this was definitely the builder that did that. So I'm glad I took it off. And it wasn't rotten, it just wasn't adhered at all. So it's always been that way. It's been in that chamber so that nothing ever got wet. You can tell where fasteners have gone through that it did creep a little bit. And that's why I always put epoxy in my fastener holes, make them a little bit bigger, and then I go ahead and I put epoxy in there, and then I re-drill them. And then any fasteners or through hole fittings like drain plugs, they're always sitting in, well, they're not in the epoxy, they're just next to it. I always put like 4200 in so you can get it out. Some people epoxy those in, which is not a good idea. I always make sure I have lots of epoxy on the inside of that grain because that's end grain. You might as well get it covered. So over drill them. Literally, you can go in there with a paintbrush. Sometimes I just fill them, then I'll re-drill them, and you know it's epoxy because you can see the white epoxy coming up. So now what I need to do is go back and fair the bottom frame section that I built. I know this one's correct, but the rest of it I left a little proud because I wasn't sure exactly how much fairing I wanted to do. Now I know that this black glue line is where I want to stop. And I'll keep pulling out, I'll keep pulling out my measuring rule to make sure I know that I've got a 3/8 inch piece going on top. I'll know exactly where I want to stop. So I'm going to get back to that with my belt sander and my 40 grit. As you saw, I cut the new skin out for the exterior of the transom frame out of a new piece of 3/8 Akume mahogany plywood, marine grade. And so I used a fat, call them the fat boys. I used that pencil with a little bit of extra to give myself, 1/4 inch, maybe. Just a little bit of extra. You cut this kind of plywood, you want to make sure you have a little extra because you mess it up, it's very expensive. So I went ahead and I clamped it, did my tracing, cut it out, put it back with clamps. And what I'll do is I'm gonna take now that I know it's pretty good, and the clamps will do the bend I need. And once I put the epoxy on the frame side, I mean the other face, I'll go ahead and I'll put it on there, clamp it, but I'm also going to map out my screw holes before and go ahead and do just some places where it'll register. I'll start in the middle and work my way out. So I'll go ahead and register some screws just for the plywood to the frame. There are other screws that go from all the way through the outside into the stringers and the keelson. So that is another set of screws. So I'm going to map out some plywood screws, fastener holes, and then go ahead and have those ready for me when I go to do the layup. So it's just one less thing I have to think about as I'm, squeeze out is coming out, and just trying to make sure I've got a nice squeeze out everywhere. So I'm going to go ahead and do that, and then I'm going to mix up some thickened epoxy. This transom was coated front and back with Smith's penetrating epoxy sealer, so it's already got at least 3 coats on, so it's pretty. The epoxy's not going to go very deep if it goes at all, but I'll go ahead and do the clear, unthickened, neat version. Look for dry spots, and I'll come back with a lot of the thickened with a spatula. I'm using a spatula for this, and make sure I've got a lot of nice epoxy on this, and go ahead and do this. Go ahead and do the clamps and the screws, and we'll do some cleanup and call this part done. I'm not too worried about the inside of this. I'm going to clean it up when the squeeze out comes through, but it's going to get sanded and painted anyway. So this was not the worst case. The bottom, I do not want any epoxy on that bottom because that'll be something I have to take out with a sander, and it's just not enough veneer there to mess around very long. So I'm going to be very careful with my squeeze out and get that cleaned up pretty quick. I'll probably end up, it'll be faced over. I'll have this upside down, so it'll all be dropping onto the frame versus the surface of the plywood anyway, so that shouldn't be a problem. It's just making sure everything is laid out and ready to go and make it happen. So I'm ready to put the neat or unthickened epoxy on the transom now, and I've been using Total Boat epoxy and West System interchangeably, not on different applications or different applications, but one boat or the other boat, not the same. I usually try to keep to the same boat. I'm using the 5-to-1. It's called the traditional, and it's the quantity of 5-to-1 in the hardener. I'm doing 8. I did 8 pumps. It's a nice number. You can always make more. Did that for at least 2 minutes. You want to stir that. Make sure it's all nice and in there, and get the bottom, get the sides. And then when I get this clear coat put on, I'm going to go ahead and add the milled glass fiber by Total Boat, and then their silica thickener. So I'll get a combination of some fibers in there for grip, and then thickener to help it get into that peanut butter state that I'm after. I've cleaned the whole surface with denatured alcohol. I sanded it, I vacuumed it, I denatured alcohol application, so now it's clean as a whistle. So all I'm going to do is just go ahead and put some of this epoxy on here. And like everything, I'm just trying to make sure that I have no spots that are dry, where the wood did not get sealed with the Smith's CPS. And it's a good prep for the surface. You'll always have enough resin knowing that you've done this. I'm trying to keep it a little bit neat because the less dripping down in the frame, the less I have to do cleanup later. And you can't really get a sander in there well, and you don't want to sand epoxy by hand for very long. It's pretty arduous. So I'm going to go ahead and finish this up, and then I'll put on the silica thickener, and then I'll use Wes and other companies like Total Boat. You can buy a notch spreader with a flat, a small, a medium, and a large tooth. And what I'll do is I'll put it on there and see what I like, and I'll start with the thin, the small one first, because I want to get it nice and thick, and go ahead and put a nice application on there, and I'll drop that plywood on. I've made I put some fastener holes down the middle for registering. I'll put it in there, register it, then I'll work my way from the inside out. Got my thickened epoxy made. I wore my respirator when I was making it up, using silica and glass fibers that are milled. Don't want to breathe that stuff, so I always have my mask on until it's wet. Got my spatula spreader. I'm going to put it on with a 2.5-inch brush, because I mean, if it was a big surface, I could just go ahead and throw it on, but I want to control it a little bit. So just going to put it on nice and thick. If you see these specs, this is the silica thickener that Total Boat puts out, and it doesn't seem to dissipate or become dust until once I get it spread on. It's still absorbing. So when I move it around with the brush and the spreader, those little balls of silica disappear. So I'm just going to put this on nice and thick. And I used 8 pumps to do the wet out of the neat epoxy. So now I did 8 again. And if you add filler and you've already wetted it out, it should be plenty. So I start with 4s and 8s, just kind of, that's the numbers I use to gauge how much I'm going to need. If you did 8 on the wet out, more than likely you'll need 8 or less to do the thickened epoxy. Once I get that on, I'm going to use the thin, or the smallest tooth, and then that'll just push that around a little bit. I think I want to go up, so I'm going to move up to medium. No, still too thin. I'm going to go with the thick one. I really want this one to be thick with epoxy, so that's what I'm going to do. I'll do the thick one when I get there. So I'm going to keep doing this, and then when I get it all troweled off with the spreader, I'll have you rejoin me when we put the plywood on and then begin the fastening process. So I will be back in a minute. All right, I've got the frame done in clear epoxy and with thickened epoxy, and then I troweled it. And then I also neat or clear coated the inside that's going to be going on that. You want to make sure you do both, because this is going to take the resin out of that and then it won't do what you want. So now both are done, and I'm going to carefully put this up here. It's going to be a little messy, but I'm going to be as careful as I can, because I do not want to get any epoxy on the surface if I can at all help it. I've got register lines in the front here, and then on the top. That allows me to get lined up, and then I can start looking at making sure that my overlap is where it belongs. So I don't want to have anything short when I put the new face on, and then that won't look good. So then I'm going to take off these gloves, and I'm going to go right to my fasteners, because with this line here and the pre-drilled fasteners, I should be able to get it exactly where I want it. So just going to just go in softly there. I found that hole, and I'm going to go up to the top one, do the same thing. And these are going to help me register where it goes. So then I'm going to walk around again, making darn sure that when this clamps down, I'm going to have that 1/4 inch reveal I want. I do. And I'm going to go to town now on putting fasteners in. And this is going to get really boring, so you're not going to want to watch this. So I'm going to start in the beginning, or excuse me, start in the middle, work my way out, and ooze the epoxy to the edges. Hope I see some pop up through these screws, which I do, which is great. So I'm just going to move my way slowly out so that the curve, because there's a couple curves going on, I want to make sure they're both there, and then have this thing done. So I'll be back in a few minutes. Well, that is the last of the fasteners. I've got really good squeeze out, and I'm going to go around with my spatula now and just clean that up, lest I have to do later. And like I said, I don't want to have to be messing around cleaning up epoxy when I've got this edge that I'm trying to sneak up on and keep, in relatively good shape. Even though that'll be hidden, this face won't. I need to make sure that that is in good shape. So I'm going to let that clean it up, let that sit for a day or two, and then I will put it on the boat. So that will end this episode. I'm going to have to do some fine tuning before I get to the episode where I have to do the installation. That'll be the next episode that you see, is this going back on the boat and all of the framework that goes into it to hold it in place. So I'll have a rear deck / transom installation video that'll come up in a couple weeks. So that'll do it for today. Thank you for tuning in. If you're not a subscriber, please think about that. Every 2 weeks on Wednesday mornings, my videos come out. That's the time period I like to use. It gives me time to enjoy doing the boat and hopefully keep it frequent enough for you. If you're enjoying the videos and Want to hit the like button? That'd be great. I always enjoy getting positive feedback. If you have any questions or concerns about what I'm doing, please put them in the comment section below and try to keep them positive if you can. And I will see you in 2 weeks.